I'm the urban conservationist with the Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship, and I'll be introducing the speakers today. With us today is Sean McMahon. He is the Executive Director of the Iowa Agricultural Water Alliance. He has more than 20 years of experience in conservation and agriculture, including leading diverse coalitions, building capacity in the ag field. He's a former director of the Nature Conservancy's North American Agricultural Program. He's also directed national land stewardship campaigns with the National Wildlife Federation. And I know working with Sean on some RCPP programs, building programs with partners throughout the state of Iowa. So Sean will be visiting with us today, and also with us is Bert Strayer. Bert is a graduate of Iowa State, with a degree in ag business, emphasis in agronomy. He began serving as a sales and marketing manager for Strayer Seed, which is a family business. Sold his first rye grain as a cover crop 30 years ago. Over the past 20 years, he's been with LaCrosse Seed. He is currently serving as the Western cover crop lead. Served in numerous leadership roles in the seed industry and community of Hudson. So, welcome both Sean and Bert to our session today, talking about barriers and scaling up conservation practices, how we can create jobs, economic development opportunities to improve water quality. So with that, Sean is going to start.
Thanks so much, Paul. Folks, are we okay with this? And is there a clicker for the slides? If not, I can just do it manually. Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks again for that introduction, Paul. So we were originally going to be joined by Matt Lechtenberg with the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship this morning, but sadly Matt has a sick kid at home, and so it's just Bert and me presenting the slides now. So please bear with us as we stumble through the transitions. We just kind of had to adjust from going to 3 presenters to 2 presenters. But as Paul was saying, I wanted to talk to you this morning about an exciting new initiative that we started about 18 months ago, called Conservation Infrastructure. And we've been really blessed and fortunate to have a lot of the leaders of this Conservation Infrastructure initiative. And I'll just start here before talking about the purpose of this work. So up until about last week, Bill Northey was one of our co-chairs, along with Ray Gasser, of this overall initiative. Of course, Secretary Northey just got confirmed as the new Undersecretary for Production and Conservation at USDA. And so Mike Nag, the new Secretary of Agriculture, is a co-chair. We've got 3 different working groups. Cover crops, which Bert co-chairs along with Sarah Carlson. Conservation drainage, which is co-chaired by Chris Hay and Charlie Schaefer. And then the strategy working group, which Mike Nag had previously co-chaired with Brian Sellinger, and now Matt Lechtenberg is co-chairing that. So what is conservation infrastructure? Let's see. So the purpose of conservation infrastructure is to really get more robust private sector investment and engagement in implementing the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy. And by doing so, how can we implement the strategy more cost effectively? So we're looking at ways to do that by harnessing economic drivers and market-based solutions to improve water quality. The Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy, of course, was created through the public sector, through agencies like IDALS, the Iowa DNR, and Iowa State. But it was always envisioned, at least by Bill Northey, that the center of balance of the nutrient reduction strategy would eventually move outside of the walls of government agencies and more into the private sector. So that's what this initiative is about. And it's also about looking at how do we get from our current level of conservation practice adoption to that future level of adoption that's needed in order to actually implement the goals of the nutrient reduction strategy. And it recognizes that we have some gaps there in order to go from our current level to our future level. So one of the things we've done is we've identified what are those barriers, what is that current missing business infrastructure for conservation practices, and we've come up with a number of recommended solutions to address those. And as we're scaling up those conservation practices, we're keeping in mind how can we do so in such a way that creates jobs and also creates economic development opportunities for rural Iowa communities and cities alike. So we've got a lot of great involvement from agencies. In addition to IDELS, we've got the Iowa Economic Development Administration, very involved, and we've got a couple dozen organizations. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bert to talk about our vision and definition of success.
Sorry if I use this, can you hear me? All right, thank you, Sean, and thank you for the introduction earlier. I work for a seed company, so I'm one of those private type companies that's taking initiative and be part of the process of implementation of the vision. And the vision that we're working with is that we envision a prosperous, sustainable, and resilient Iowa with healthy soil and water, and economically vibrant communities that is recognized as the national leader in both agriculture and conservation. Now, just that in itself, I think, is important, that we've got a common vision. I think that's something that those of us out in the private sector, we all have our individual initiatives, our goals as companies, and the way we operate, our business plans and business models. But this gives us a template of how, from the private side, we can interact with the governmental agencies that Sean has mentioned. So I think that vision is important, and just by having that in and of itself has been important as far as when the private sector wants to engage, how do we do this, and how do we all pull together? So with that then, there's that definition of success. The conservation practices are economically compelling and easier for farmers and landowners to implement. And that's something that was given to us, through Secretary Northern, that we need something that's economically viable, that it makes sense, and it's also easy to put into practice and easy to understand, by landowners, growers, all the different stakeholders. How does this work? Increased investments in conservation practices that lead to healthy soil and improved water quality for the benefits of all Iowans and downstream communities. So how that relates to economic development, there are a few examples just on this slide. One, it enhances just the quality of life and living environments. In that slide in the upper left, we got, it's good for those on the farm. We've got healthier soils. It's a better base for productivity. There are a few other slides here, maybe just to give some examples of maybe some of the economic opportunities that come out of this. And that slide in the upper middle there with it's a planter. Well, as we put different practices into place, different planting opportunities, there are opportunities to tweak the type of equipment to do a better job. Maybe it's fewer passes, less tillage, all those different things. We have a conversation around equipment, and that's going to provide some economic opportunity within the state of Iowa. The example in the upper right there is LaCrosse Seed sales. That's an ag retailer. That's a seed business within the state that they are supportive of cover crops. Okay, they're taking the initiative to learn more about cover crops, how to give good advice to their growers in their neighborhood. They've had meetings. They've called in experts and had meetings, very well attended. So that's an example of an economic advantage of a retailer in the state of Iowa. We've got hundreds of retailers in the state of Iowa. That's just one who's picked up the ball and started to run with it. And I mentioned earlier about sustainable and resilient, soils within the state. Mitchell Hora, in the picture on the bottom right, is a young man that just graduated from Iowa State. He's formed a new business around soil health and helping growers understand through testing what the status of their soil is, how it's changing through the use of cover crops and changing different practices. Okay, so one, it's an economic opportunity for Mitchell and others like him to take those assessments, but then also it gives the confidence to growers that as they make changes in their systems, that they're doing things in a sustainable way. So that's part of the equation that we've noticed. We need to ramp that up. So I think we got some pretty clear definitions for the vision and success, if that makes sense. Okay, so my little piece of the world here is, as Sean mentioned, I serve as a co-chair for one of the committees within that infrastructure group, which is cover crops, and I serve as a co-chair with Sarah Carlson from Practical Farmers. That through the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy, it's been identified that in order to meet some of the goals of within that strategy, that it's going to take approximately 12 to 17 million acres of cover crops within the state of Iowa. That's a pretty big number. That's a huge number. That if you look at the current status, 625,000 acres of cover crops, okay, that number has been increasing year over year. It increased again this last year. We're somewhat north of 700,000 acres. But the long and short story is that we're about 20x from where we need to be. From today to where we're even minimally meeting the lower standards for accomplishing the goals within the nutrient reduction strategy. So there's a lot of opportunity within building the infrastructure to get from where we're at now, to that large number on the minimum side of 12 million acres. So those future opportunities, mentioned a few in that prior slide, but we're looking at, as an example, to provide enough seed to cover that many acres. We're looking at perhaps 300,000 acres of seed production. Say, for example, rye, grain, oats, those types of seeds that we can grow within the state, potentially. As it is now, most of the cover crop seed is coming in from the Plain States of Canada, most notably, rye, grain, and oats. To put that into context, 300,000 acres of seed production is more than what the state of Iowa produces for seed corn. And we're known as the seed corn capital of the world, right? To put that into a frame of reference, that's a lot of seed. It's a lot of acres. Okay, so with that, there's the infrastructure needs to support that. So let's get down to seed cleanup. So the seed's coming out of the field. There's an opportunity for a lot of businesses to clean seed, to make sure that the seed that we're turning around and using is of the right quality, that we're not creating problems moving wheat seed from field to field. So with that then, after it's clean, we need to get it planted. Okay, so we've got opportunities for, say, up to 300 additional aerial seed applicators. And as I mentioned in an earlier slide, there's different ways of getting seed in the ground. So we've got adaptation of equipment, and then there's also the opportunity for retailers or custom applicators to apply the seed. And then perhaps for overwintering cover crops to terminate that crop the following year. So there's a lot of economic impact that's within the building of this infrastructure. It's not going to happen overnight because those are pretty big numbers. And that we're looking at 17,000 semis required to move that much seed. It's a lot of trucks. We've got a truck shortage as it is within our society in the United States. Our infrastructure is short of trucks. So that's on the cover crop side. So if we look in the ag drainage, which is another committee within the infrastructure group, bioreactors and saturated buffers, as an example, that identified within the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy that we would need up to 120,000 bioreactors. Everybody familiar with what a bioreactor is? Okay. That we would need up to 120,000. Basically, 100 is inconsequential. Just saying we're going to need 120,000 more, potentially, to help reach those goals. All right, so this is just kind of an example, or maybe a representation of what's been going on. A progress report that since this initiative was conceived and put into place, that we've had 25 meetings and workshops. I say that's a number that's continuing to grow. I mean, there have been meetings this past week, and there's outlying meetings where there's representation from the Iowa Ag Water Alliance and partners. As you can see, there's been several meeting participants. And participants at these meetings, we're trying to bring in those that have got different perspectives within different parts of the industry related to these issues. Trying to talk with the experts, and, including all the different stakeholders and, get many different sites so that we can hone in on the right way to, say, come up with solutions to barriers. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And through the process of all these discussions, we'll come up with 40 recommendations, to present to IDOLs, and, Sean can talk to that. And of those 40 recommendations, there are 20 that are in progress. And hopefully those are quantifiable, that we can present that, hey, we are striving to meet the goals set within the Iowa Insurance Reduction Strategy. There's a list of participants on that slide to show that we've got public sector, private sector, and I'm sure that there's always room for more. And this is where we're all pulling together. And there's some pretty good names on that list. And I'd like to think that they're all, say, on the private side, say like LaCrosse Seed and other entities, that are understanding that we need to have this public-private sector relationship and to multiply the factors of all the funding and efforts available. Okay, so here's just an example of some plotting that we did. So we have within the cover crop committee, we've got a core working group where we've got, let's say, a half a dozen or so pretty active folks within different areas from agriculture. And we've identified barriers in the adoption of cover crops. So we're starting to get more specific within our committee, just relating to cover crops and identifying those barriers and then coming up with solutions. And an example of the plotting, so that slide that Sean was showing, the plotting, it looks pretty tight. That on the axis on the left there, the size of the benefit, and then on the lower axis, the likelihood of success. Well, those are plotted pretty close together because the committee initially, we're looking at, okay, what are the things that we can really do? I mean, so it kind of self-sorted out, so we've got a pretty tight pattern. And the slide on the right represents short-term, intermediate, long-term involvement, and then the likelihood of success. So I would say with statistically, even those that are saying that lower left are probably accomplishable if we have the right effort and the right people involved. It probably as accountable as those in the upper right. Okay, so we did some survey activity around cover crops, and this is just a snippet. There's several goals and recommendations within the cover crop committee, as there are with the other committees. Just a few examples that are public. Say like the purple short term, which number is that there? Okay. So that we've identified some things that are in place, and perhaps with some fine tuning and some better messaging to get more people involved and accomplish those goals sooner. And some without research or the requirement for additional research and development, it might take us a little longer. And some things we've identified just are going to be hard to do.
Excellent. Thank you, Bert. So of those 49 recommendations, a number of those were through the cover crops working group that Bert is co-chairing with Sarah Carlson of Practical Farmers of Iowa. Several were through the conservation drainage working group, co-chaired by Chris Hay of the Iowa Soybean Association and Charlie Schaefer with AgriDrain. And we don't have time to go through all of the recommendations now, but as Bert was saying, these recommendations really address the barriers. What's that missing infrastructure? So for instance, for cover crops, like Bert said, to reach that much higher acreage, we're going to need more farmers growing seed. We're going to need more seed cleaning businesses. We're going to need more custom applicators, more channel partners for distributing seed, and more equipment, drills, high clearance interseeders, and aerial equipment. On the conservation drainage side, to go from about 100 saturated buffers and bioreactors to 120,000 that we need to implement the nutrient reduction strategy, we're going to need a lot more equipment, like drainage control structures. We're going to need a lot more contractors, like the Iowa chapter of the Land Improvement Contractors. So there's going to be a lot of business development and economic development opportunities as we scale up these practices. Likewise, through the strategy group, which is co-chaired by Brian Sellinger with the Iowa Economic Development Administration and now Matt Lechtenberg, with IDALs. There's been a number of recommendations that have to do not only with cover crops and conservation drainage, but what are those enabling conditions statewide that need to be in place to incentivize businesses making even bigger investments in conservation practices. And I should say that IDALs, Iowa State, Iowa Economic Development Administration, IWA, and others that have been involved in this, we're trying to signal to the private sector community that there are these business development opportunities, and there's money to be made through expanding and creating new business lines around conservation practices. So of those 49 recommendations coming out of the different working groups, as Bert said, about 20 of them are already in progress, and we're now really pivoting to implementation. And so we're coming up with a conservation infrastructure action plan that IDALS has indicated they would like to include in the next update of the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy. And so this is just an outline of some of the elements that we'll have in that action plan in addition to those recommendations. But we're also weaving together those different recommendations into projects. We're calling them implementation projects. Again, several of these are already underway. But we're really looking at being very explicit about which recommendations we're addressing and what objectives are we setting out and what are the partners that'll be involved in implementation, as well as what are the strategies, what are the funding gaps, and a time-bound schedule for when we plan to implement these different projects. And finally, we're really moving on this path towards implementation, but at the same time, we're hoping to get this action plan adopted into the nutrient reduction strategy, potentially by the 5th anniversary of the strategy at the end of May. It could be later than that, but we're looking at sometime this year. We're also committed to having another conservation infrastructure conference, and that will be in November of this year. And I should say we've gotten great participation, as Bert mentioned, but we welcome additional participation. Whether it's in this conference or whether it's the folks in this room, if you want to be involved in any of these projects for scaling up cover crops, conservation drainage practices, or other practices. This is a big tent, and everyone's welcome to participate. So, what should farmers and landowners do vis-a-vis conservation infrastructure? Well, we're recommending just start somewhere, one practice and one field at a time. And what can you do? Well, we'd encourage all of you to get involved in conservation infrastructure. So I put up the contact information of my colleague Caitlin Little. She's the program coordinator for the Iowa Agriculture Water Lines. I'd also like to recognize a couple other partners or colleagues in the back of the room. We've got Jim Jordahl. You could raise your hand. Jim is the program director for the Iowa Agriculture Water Lines. And is Zita here? Okay, Zita was here earlier. She's the communications director. I should say we've had a lot of great participation through the Iowa Business Council, which Bert's colleague chairs, Dan Ford. He's the CEO of LaCrosse Seed, the nation's largest cover crops company. We've got other seed companies, fertilizer, farm equipment, precision ag companies, consulting companies. I see Sam Wildman with the Context Network is here, another business council member. And we've also had great participation through the IWA Advisory Council, which is comprised of leads of federal and state agencies, Iowa State, University of Iowa, also now every major Iowa commodity ag group, and also conservation organizations and urban interests. But again, we really welcome much more participation. So if any of you are interested in getting involved, please see me after this, or again, contact Caitlin. So with that, Bert and I would be happy to entertain any questions as time permits.
Yeah, we do have time, so yeah, questions.
What are your criteria to participate?
Well, I don't know that we really have any criteria for that, but just anyone willing to roll up their sleeves and help scale up voluntary conservation practices. So I think that's about it.
Do you have to have watershed alliances and all this stuff, and all that stuff?
No, certainly not. So anyone can plug in.
I've been to this before, and I've gotten no response out of the group.
Out of what group now?
The Iowa Ag Alliance.
Really? Okay, well, talk to me afterwards, and we'd be happy to get you plugged in. Other questions?
So a lot of the, especially the cover crop and a lot of the other 49 regulations are voluntarily driven right now. Do you see, I mean, what's really probably going to push business and make business a real big opportunity is this becoming like mandatory? Do you see that happening?
I'll weigh in first. So, it's certainly possible that there, might be some kind of, future increased regulation when it comes to water quality and particularly non-point source runoff, which is not regulated under the Clean Water Act. I don't really see that there's a strong likelihood of that happening through Congress in terms of amending the Clean Water Act. I don't see likelihood in the near future with that happening through the Iowa State Legislature somehow. As we've seen before, there have been legal challenges along those lines. So there was a recent case with Des Moines Water Works. So it's possible something like that might come to pass through the courts. We've been working hard to really scale up these voluntary conservation practices, and we've been making progress, particularly where we're getting the resources necessary and where we've got the watershed approach, where we've got a watershed plan in place, where we've got good boots on the ground delivering technical assistance, where we've got some extra financial assistance, for instance, through the RCPP project that we're co-leading with IDALS, the Midwest Ag Water Quality Partnership, $48 million project, and also where we have really engaged farmer leaders and agribusinesses and community leaders. I think where we're able to target resources, in the watershed, a priority watershed, and then within the watershed to the priority acres, what we call precision conservation. That's been really successful. So if we're able to scale that up, I think we'll successfully demonstrate that we can, in fact, continue to improve water quality through our current voluntary regime. But there are some who disagree with that approach.
I would say certainly as representative of the ag industry, it would be our collective goal to minimize regulation. To minimize it, certainly we need to be engaged now to voluntarily come up with methods that meet some of those goals that are important for water quality. From a grower's standpoint, some of the things that they can do to avoid regulation, need to understand and say soil health. What are those measurements? The cover cropping in itself, we understand, can alleviate several problems. But what is the cost offset? Who's paying for that?
Right.
Are we increasing the value of this? As we increase soil health, how is that increasing the value of that asset?
Right. And I didn't mean my question to go in the wrong direction. I know there's the argument of whether voluntary is going to work, towards the water quality goals, but the prospect of, business putting money into this type of thing, I think cover crop, whether somebody wants to do them or not, is a lot based on what the price of the commodity is at the time, so.
Price of the commodity, also, what is the cost of applying the cover crops? What's the cost share available? Again, where we've been applying that watershed approach and those critical success factors, we've seen certain watersheds have a 400% increase in cover crops in 1 year, or a 900% increase. There's examples like Miller Creek, where they're now at 20% of all the row crop acres in the entire watershed in cover crops, compared to the statewide average of 3%. And I would point out that back in 2010, we had 10,000 acres of cost-shared cover crops, an estimated total of less than 25,000 statewide. This last year, it's estimated we hit 760,000. So we went from about nothing to 3% in less than a decade. We're kind of scaling up exponentially. But the conservation infrastructure effort is really about recognizing that where we are today is not sufficient to meet the scale of the challenge, and we need more private sector engagement, more public sector engagement. We need everyone pulling on the same rope in the same direction at the same time in alignment with the nutrient reduction strategy. So if we're able to do that, we'll get more investment and be able to implement the strategy more cost effectively. Is there a question in back? Yes.
Yeah. You mentioned 300,000 acres estimated in terms of discussion as to where you see those acres coming from? Those are converted from corn and soybeans, or they targeted to high arable lands? Any discussion on that?
Let's see. So the two species that are used mostly in the state of Iowa now, the greatest item used is rye grain. We can grow rye grain seed in the state of Iowa, and we can grow the second one, oats, in the state of Iowa. Because whether we can do it viably within our systems to where it makes sense financially, we do have certainly an advantage in growing soybeans and corn. Environmentally, we just got the right conditions and the right soils, and we're set for that. So it'd be a transition as we grow more rye grain in the state of Iowa. Because generally those crops that are there maturing, the rye grain and oats, in the middle of the summer, where we can have hot, humid conditions that can be detrimental to the development and maturity of that seed crop. So we may need to learn new things as far as how we treat those crops so that we protect, say, the germination and quality of the seed if we move those to a greater proportion within the state. As I said, now most of them are grown, the oats and rye grain and other species, maybe wheat, pretty good, in say dry plain states where they don't have the summer humidity. So they do the Dakotas and then take that straight north, into western Canada.
So we have time, sorry, Bert.
Yep.
Did you have a final statement on
No,
that?
that works.
Okay, so we have time for just one more question. Jennifer?
So when you're talking about rural economic development, I just want to share that councils of governments are often designated economic development areas through the Economic Development Authority, the Federal Economic Development Authority, and it might be worthwhile to engage them. We at our COG have several revolving loan funds that are available throughout our region. If there's a business that, say, you said something, there's lack of equipment, for example, investment or expansion of a business, those are eligible to apply for that. So they're typically low-cost revolving loans.
Excellent. So things like a, no-till drill or strip-till
Right.
toolbar.
I want to expand my
Seed
business,
cleaning,
and this is a barrier,
equipment.
and I need some assistance. And I think it would be definitely worth linking that up.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Jennifer. I wasn't aware of that. So we've got a few more minutes
Both
before
will
the
be
next
around,
session.
they'll be around the rest of the day, right?
No, wait, one final comment.
Yep.
I'm not sure if Sean knows this, but on this slide, this is a meaningful slide to me. And the gentleman on the left is Louis Beck, and he was my ag advisor when I was in high school. Long, long time ago. He was fresh out of college, and he was at Hudson. That was his first job, and I was a sophomore in high school when I met Louis. And when I came to Iowa State, at not only my father's suggestion, but Lewis's suggestion, like a young man, I dealt with things that wasn't quite sure if I believed in, questioned what the direction I was taking. There were some things that I thought, hey, this isn't right. I'm not going to give up. This situation's not right. Okay. Lewis challenged me, goes, if you believe in that, if you believe in the greater goal, what can you do? How do you get involved? So I think it's coincidental that Lewis ended up on this slide, but he challenged me, and I would say I think quite often, how do I get in a position where I can make a difference? If I believe in it, learn a little bit more, and I challenge all of us. I think that was the challenge with this slide, but that's a perfect gentleman to have on the slide. Thank you.
Thanks, Bert. And the other gentleman in the slide is Shane Wolf, and he's that watershed coordinator for Miller Creek, the watershed I mentioned that actually got to 20% of all the row crop acres in the watershed into cover crops this year. So great closing comments. The next session starts here in 5 minutes, but if you want to visit with Bert and me afterwards, we can meet you out in the hall by those doors.
Let's thank Sean.